Some families are remembered for wealth, some for power. But the Napiers are remembered for something else entirely. A bloodline whispered about in hushed tones across the hollows of Appalachia, where superstition clings to the mountains like morning fog. The Napier name carried with it a legacy of violence, inbreeding, and tragedy so deep, locals swore the family itself was cursed. Welcome to Eerie Records, where forgotten bloodlines and hidden histories come alive. Tonight, we unravel the haunting legacy of the Napier family, a tale so dark it still stains the soil of Appalachia. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time of night this story has reached you. And if you're new here, subscribe and join our dark family for more chilling history. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, in the rolling mist of eastern Kentucky, whispers linger about a family that never escaped the shadows of its own name, the Napiers. Old men sitting on wooden porches still recall the stories, their words slow and weighted with warning. For more than 2 centuries, the Napier bloodline has been marked, not only by tragedy, but by something far darker, something many dare not name aloud. They call it the curse of the Napiers. The Napier family traces its roots back to the early 1800s, when Scottish immigrants carried their surname into the hollows of Virginia and Kentucky. At first, the Napiers were respected, hard-working farmers, skilled hunters, and men who could hold their own in the unforgiving wilderness. But behind their strong reputation, a shadow was already forming. A violent feud in 1829, recorded in local court documents, would stain their name for generations. In the spring of that year, a dispute over land near Clay County escalated into bloodshed. 2 Napier brothers, John and Samuel, stood accused of murdering a neighboring family during a bitter fight over coal-rich ground. Though evidence was murky and justice in those days was anything but clear, the court found them guilty. Both men were hanged in 1830. Their deaths, however, didn't silence the stories, it ignited them. Neighbors whispered that the Napier curse was sealed that day, with the rope tightening not only around their necks, but around the fate of their bloodline. From then on, calamity followed the family like a shadow. Sons were lost in the Civil War at a rate far higher than their neighbors. Wives died young, often under mysterious or violent circumstances. By the late 19th century, newspapers in Harlan County carried sensational headlines linking the Napier name to yet another feud, another killing, another grave dug too soon. But was it coincidence? Or something far more sinister? The locals swore it wasn't chance. They told of strange sightings around Napier land, shadowy figures on the hills at night, livestock slaughtered with no trace of an attacker, children waking in terror, whispering that they'd seen a man with no face at the foot of their bed. Ministers in the mountains preached that the family had made a pact with the devil himself, a bargain that began with blood and would never be repaid. By the turn of the century, the Napier name was no longer spoken with respect. It was spoken with fear. Families warned their daughters never to marry into it. Preachers urged their congregations to steer clear of Napier land. For in Appalachia, where superstition and faith intertwine, a cursed name can weigh heavier than sin itself. And for the Napiers, this was only the beginning. The late 1800s in Appalachia were a time when law was written less in courthouses and more in gunpowder. And for the Napier family, that truth was carved into the hills with every feud that bore their name. By 1878, the Napiers had become central figures in a deadly rivalry with another powerful clan, the Sizemores. It began, like so many Appalachian feuds with land, coal seams hidden beneath the soil of Perry County. The coal companies hadn't yet arrived in full force, but both families knew the land held riches that could change their fortunes forever. The dispute turned violent one summer night when Thomas Napier, the youngest of 6 brothers, was gunned down outside a tavern in Hazard, Kentucky. Witnesses claimed they saw 2 Sizemore men flee into the darkness, but before the sheriff could bring order, the Napier kin took justice into their own hands. Within a week, 2 Sizemores were dead, their bodies left along the creek bed as a warning. What followed was years of tit-for-tat killings that left the Hollows haunted with fear. By 1883, the feud had claimed more than a dozen lives on both sides. Newspapers, such as the Louisville Courier-Journal, began reporting on the bloodshed, painting the Napiers as ruthless mountain men, quick to kill and impossible to tame. Journalists loved to sensationalize their name, but locals whispered something else entirely. The feud wasn't just about land or revenge, it was about the curse. A story passed down from that time tells of a Napier matriarch, Eleanor Ellie. Napier, who was said to have begged her sons to lay down their arms and break free from the blood-soaked pattern. But when they refused, Ellie fell into despair. One night in 1881, she was found dead in her cabin, her Bible clutched in her hand, her face frozen in what neighbors described as pure horror. Some claimed she'd seen something no mortal eyes were meant to see. From then on, the family's reputation deepened into legend. It wasn't simply that the Napiers killed or were killed, it was that their deaths carried an almost ritual weight, as if some unseen hand was marking each grave. Grave markers for Napier men in the Hazard Cemetery bear dates that seem eerily clustered. 3 brothers dead in 1881, 2 cousins in 1883, another in 1884. When coal barons finally arrived in eastern Kentucky in the early 1900s, they found a land littered not only with resources, but with graves tied to the Napier feud. And still, the family could not escape tragedy. Even as new opportunities rose with the railroads and the mines, the curse of their bloodline only seemed to strengthen. For in the Appalachian hills, blood runs deep, and for the Napiers it seemed to run only in one color, red. By the turn of the 20th century, Appalachia was changing. Railroads carved through mountains, and coal companies swept into Kentucky and West Virginia with promises of wealth. For many families, this was salvation, steady work, company housing, and wages in company scrip. But for the Napier bloodline, the coal boom only deepened the curse that already clung to their name. In 1904, the Napier patriarch, Samuel Black Sam Napier, signed one of the earliest contracts with the Blue Diamond Coal Company. Locals whispered that Sam never signed, with pen and ink, but with something darker. They claimed he stood at the crossroads outside Hazard, beneath a twisted oak tree, and struck a bargain not with businessmen, but with the devil himself. The contract was real enough, but the legend said the signature came at a cost: the soul of his children. True or not, tragedy followed quickly. Within 2 years, 2 of Sam's sons were killed in separate mine collapses, both on the same day in different shafts. The odds of such a coincidence were staggering, and yet the newspapers recorded it. March 12, 1906. Their names, carved in stone, still rest side by side in a Perry County graveyard. As coal towns rose around them, the Napiers gained a reputation for both prosperity and misfortune. They were often among the first hired for dangerous jobs, hauling coal carts through collapsing tunnels. Yet they were also the first to die in accidents, cave-ins, and unexplained blasts. Workers began whispering that no Napier should ever go below ground. Some claimed the mines themselves hungered for their blood. By 1912, the Napier name was linked not only to feuds and gunfights, but also to strikes and violence against coal bosses. Several Napier men were accused of being troublemakers, riling up miners to demand safer conditions. But every protest seemed to end the same way: someone in the family dead before justice could be served. Perhaps the most chilling tale comes from the winter of 1917. During a strike in Harlan County, a Napier miner named Elias was arrested after an altercation with company guards. Witnesses swore he looked perfectly healthy when taken into custody. Yet just 2 nights later, his lifeless body was found hanging in his cell. The sheriff called it suicide. The locals called it sacrifice. Whether through feud, mine accident, or mysterious death, the Napier story grew darker with each passing year. And while other families prospered in the coal era, the Napiers seemed chained to a cycle of blood that no wealth could break. It was as if every dollar they earned carried a shadow, and every step forward only dragged them deeper into a bargain no one in the family could escape. If the Napier curse had been whispered before, it was in the early 1920s that the legend grew teeth. That was the era of Margaret Napier, a woman remembered in Perry County court records, but far better known in folklore as the Witch of Troublesome Creek. Born in 1887, Margaret was said to be different from the rest of her kin. Where most Napiers were hard men, coal miners, moonshiners, or fighters, Margaret was quiet, sharp-eyed, and deeply superstitious. Locals said she kept jars of herbs hanging from the rafters, burned black candles in her cabin, and could heal, or curse, with equal skill. Troublesome Creek, a twisting vein of water cutting through Knott County, became her domain. Farmers swore their cattle went lame if they crossed her land. Children whispered that if you looked in Margaret's window, at midnight, you'd see her speaking to shadows that had no form. And yet, when sickness spread through the coal camps in 1923, it was Margaret's poultices and tinctures that saved dozens of lives. But the line between healer and witch is thin in Appalachia. By 1925, suspicion outweighed gratitude. Several neighbors accused Margaret of hexing their crops, and when a rash of stillbirths struck the valley, whispers pointed to her. Court records confirm she was charged with practicing the arts of conjuration, a phrase pulled directly from archaic laws meant to silence women deemed unnatural. Though she was never convicted, her trial sealed the Napier reputation. Newspapers began calling them the cursed line, not only plagued by violence and tragedy, but also bound to superstition and witchcraft. The story most often told is one of Margaret's final nights. In 1929, a lightning storm swept across Troublesome Creek. Witnesses claimed to see her cabin struck not once but 3 times in the same hour. When neighbors rushed to the scene the next morning, the cabin was nothing but blackened ash. Margaret's body was never found. Some said she was incinerated on the spot, taken by the devil she served. Others whispered she simply walked in too. The storm, finally free of the curse she had carried for decades. After Margaret's disappearance, the Napiers' standing in the community plummeted. The name itself seemed to draw suspicion. Children were forbidden to play with Napier offspring. Women hesitated to marry into the bloodline. And in a land where faith and fear went hand in hand, the Napiers found themselves branded not just unlucky, but unholy. From that point on, the Napier curse was no longer a quiet rumor. It was a legend etched into every holler, a story carried on every coal train whistle, and a fear that the bloodline had mingled too closely with forces best left alone. The Great Depression hit Appalachia with a cruelty that can scarcely be measured. By 1930, the coalfields of eastern Kentucky had become a crucible of violence, poverty, and rage. And the Napier family, already marked by whispers of witchcraft and doom, found themselves thrust into the bloodiest chapter of mountain history, the Harlan County Coal Wars, remembered grimly as Bloody Harlan. Coal was life, but it was also death. The mines paid starvation wages, company stores trapped men in endless debt, and the coal dust blackened lungs until they failed. When unions rose up demanding fair pay and safer conditions, coal operators responded with gun thugs, private militias, and bribes to local lawmen. It was a war without battlefields, fought in alleys, saloons, and shadowed ridges. Among the men on those ridges were the Napiers. Records from 1931 list James Napier and his cousin Ezekiel Napier as miners at the Brookside camp. Both joined the fledgling United Mine Workers, and both became targets. Ezekiel was ambushed outside a tavern on August 14, 1931, gunned down by deputies loyal to the coal barons. His body, riddled with bullets, was laid out on the porch of his mother's cabin, a warning to every miner who dared defy the company. James Napier fared no better. On November 4, 1932, he vanished during a strike near Evarts. Witnesses claimed to hear gunfire echoing across the hills, but no body was ever recovered. For weeks, his wife lit a lantern in the window, praying he'd return. Instead, her house burned to the ground that winter, killing her and their 2 small children. The official cause was said to be a tipped-over oil lamp, but neighbours whispered of the curse, as though fire and tragedy followed the Napier name wherever it rooted. Folklore entwined itself with these bloody facts. In the mining camps, men swore they saw ghostly figures on the picket lines, shadowy forms that moved with the strikers, carrying rifles that never fired but filled their enemies with dread. And always, someone muttered, "Them's the Napiers. Even the dead ones won't rest." By the end of the 1930s, the Napier bloodline was both feared and pitied. They were martyrs to some, villains to others, but cursed in the eyes of all. When coal finally collapsed during the Depression and families fled the mountains for cities, the Napier name lingered like smoke in the hollers. Hard to see, harder to forget. The tragedy of Bloody Harlan had claimed countless lives. But for the Napiers, it was more than loss. It was another knot in the twisted cord of their history, binding their legacy ever tighter to death, fire, and Appalachian blood. When World War II erupted in 1939, the hollowed hills of Appalachia stirred, with both pride and dread. Boys who had grown up in poverty, in cabins of rough-hewn timber, suddenly found themselves called to the great battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. For the Napier family, this meant a chance at honor, or so they believed. 2 brothers, Thomas Napier and Henry Napier, enlisted in 1942, leaving the hills of Harlan County for the distant barracks of Fort Knox. Locals remembered their mother weeping on the porch, clutching a Bible in one hand and a faded photograph of her sons in the other. She told a neighbor, "This family's blood is already promised to death. The war will just collect its due." Her words proved hauntingly prophetic. Thomas Napier was sent to France with the 45th Infantry Division. On June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, his unit advanced inland. Letters preserved in a trunk in Hazard, Kentucky, tell of Thomas hearing strange voices in the hedgerows the night before he was killed. According to surviving soldiers, Thomas was shot while running toward an enemy machine gun nest, but some swore he collapsed before a bullet touched him, as if struck down by an unseen hand. Henry Napier's fate was even more unsettling. Stationed in the Pacific, he fought in the brutal campaigns of the Philippines. Fellow soldiers recalled Henry speaking in his sleep, muttering in what one described as a language no man living should know. In April 1945, during the Battle of Luzon, Henry vanished in the jungle. His weapon and gear were found near a shallow stream, but no trace of his body was ever recovered. One soldier swore he saw Henry walking barefoot into the mist, whispering, "It's calling me home." Back in Kentucky, their mother received both telegrams within a year: Thomas killed in action, Henry missing and presumed dead. She died shortly thereafter, reportedly babbling about the debt being paid. Some said she clawed at the walls of her cabin before her final breath, leaving gouges that resembled strange symbols. The community, steeped in superstition, grew convinced that the Napier curse had grown beyond Appalachia. It had stretched across oceans into the trenches and jungles of faraway wars. Even in Europe, soldiers claimed to see a gaunt-faced figure in the shadows of battlefields, watching silently, disappearing before dawn. For the Napiers, service to their country did not bring redemption. Instead, it carried their doom across continents, binding their cursed bloodline not only to the haunted mountains of Appalachia, but to the very soil of foreign lands soaked in war. The war ended, but the Napier bloodline found no peace. By the late 1940s, the surviving branches of the family had returned to the coal towns of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, where black dust coated the lungs of men and the spirits of their families. To most, the post-war boom promised steady work and new beginnings. But for the Napiers, the mines seemed to breathe the curse itself. In 1948, John Napier, a cousin of the fallen Thomas and Henry, took a job in the No. 9 mine near Harlan. Fellow miners claimed John worked tirelessly, but he spoke often of seeing figures deep in the shafts. "They stand just outside the lantern light," he once whispered. as if waiting for me to take the last step. On January 12, 1949, an explosion rocked the mine. 10 men died instantly, their bodies burned and crushed. John was not among them. His helmet and pickaxe were found, but his body was never recovered. Rescuers insisted the blast could not have erased him completely. Something else had taken him deeper, beyond the tunnels they dared to enter. By the early 1950s, the Napier family cabins along Clover Fork Hollow stood in disrepair. The widows and children who remained told stories of whispers at night, of footsteps on porches where no man stood. A young girl named Clara Napier was said to have sleepwalked nightly, her bare feet carrying her down to the creek where she would stand silently, staring at the water. In 1953, Clara vanished. Her footprints led into the creek bed and stopped at the edge, though the water was too shallow to conceal a body. The locals began avoiding the Napier land altogether. Hunters swore that no deer crossed their fields. Children whispered that the trees themselves bent away from the family's cabins. And in church, some spoke quietly of the Napier mark, a fate sealed long before birth. In 1955, a preacher named Reverend Silas Kincaid declared publicly that the Napier curse was the work of the devil himself. He organized nightly prayer meetings on the hollow's edge, candles glowing like watchfires in the dark. But the prayers seemed only to provoke the curse. One evening, as the congregation sang hymns, the mountain shook with what some swore was laughter, low, rumbling, inhuman. Several lanterns blew out at once, and when light returned, strange claw-like gouges scarred the church door. By the close of the 1950s, the Napier name had become synonymous with dread. Their bloodline was shrinking, picked apart by accidents, disappearances, and whispers of something darker. For the people of Appalachia, the Napier curse was no longer folklore. It was a living presence, one that haunted both mineshafts and midnight fields, reminding all who lived nearby that some families carried debts too ancient to ever repay. The 1960s brought change to Appalachia. Highways cut through valleys, once hidden from the world, and young outsiders, hippies, drifters, and seekers of something authentic wandered into coal country, drawn by cheap land and the allure of a simpler life. But for those who stumbled, into Clover Fork Hollow, where the Napier cabins still clung to the earth, curiosity often became catastrophe. In the summer of 1967, 2 college students from Ohio, Ruth and David Whitman, rented an abandoned shack near the Napier land. They were enthralled by the mountains, by the songs of cicadas at dusk, and the hush of pine forests at night. Locals warned them politely, "Not that hollow, it ain't safe." But Ruth and David only laughed, assuming it was rural superstition. Within weeks, their laughter faded. Ruth began to dream of a woman with hair matted like roots standing at her bedside. David told neighbors of hearing knocks at their door each night, but when he opened it, no one was there, only the sound of rushing water, though the creek lay dry. On August 14th, the couple vanished. Their belongings remained untouched. A single phrase was carved into the doorframe: "The debt is not yours to pay." That same year, one of the last remaining Napiers, Margaret Napier, tried to leave Appalachia entirely. She sold her father's land and moved north to Dayton, Ohio. For a while, it seemed she had escaped. She found work in a factory, married, a kind man, and bore 2 children. But in 1971, tragedy returned. Her youngest son drowned in a bathtub while Margaret swore she had only turned away for seconds. A year later, her husband died in a freak machinery accident. By 1973, Margaret had returned to Clover Fork Hollow, widowed and broken. "You cannot run from the mountain," she told neighbors. "It follows." Meanwhile, folklorists and amateur occultists began arriving, curious about whispered tales of the Napier curse. A Louisville professor, Dr. Eliza Monroe, published a paper in 1975 claiming the Napier legacy was tied to pre-Christian rituals practiced by early Scots-Irish settlers, rites that demanded blood sacrifice to appease ancient spirits of the land. Her research linked the Napiers to one of these sects. After her paper circulated, Dr. Monroe visited Clover Fork herself. She was never seen again. By the late 1970s, the Napier Hollow had become a place no local entered after dark. Hunters reported seeing strange fires flickering in the distance, though no one claimed them. Roadside travelers spoke of figures standing silently at tree lines, watching, waiting. And in 1979, when a young boy wandered too close to the hollow while chasing a stray dog, he returned mute, unable to speak a word for the rest of his life. The world was modernizing. Televisions glowed in living rooms, neon signs lit up small towns. But the Napier curse did not fade with time. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, feeding on the intrusion of outsiders, lashing out whenever its secrets were probed. For the people of Appalachia, Clover Fork Hollow was no longer just a cursed family's land. It was a wound in the earth itself, one that refused to heal. By the 1980s, America was awash in skepticism. The rise of tabloids, talk shows, and cable television had given the strange and the supernatural new stages to perform upon. Ghost hunters, self-styled demonologists, and even hardened journalists were eager to test Appalachian folklore against the light of modern reason. And none drew more fascination than the legend of the Napier curse. In 1982, the Lexington Herald-Leader ran an article titled "The Haunted Hollow, Appalachian Superstition or Family Tragedy." The piece suggested the Napier legacy was nothing more than a combination of poverty, isolation, and inherited mental illness. But the journalist who wrote it, Thomas Clay, was never able to enjoy his success. Weeks after publication, he suffered a fatal car crash on Route 25E, a road that locals noted ran directly past the turnoff to Clover Fork Hollow. Witnesses swore his brakes had failed, though the car was nearly new. By the mid-80s, the paranormal boom was in full swing. In 1985, a group of amateur investigators, calling themselves the Kentucky Spirit Society, ventured into the hollow with tape recorders and cameras. They captured only fragments, distorted whispers, sudden bursts of static, and a chilling voice, repeating, "You are not blood." 2 weeks later, every member of the group reported nightmares so vivid they could not sleep more than an hour each night. One man, overcome with exhaustion, stepped off a factory roof where he worked and plummeted to his death. The most sensational case came in 1987, when syndicated television host Gerald Dwyer filmed a Halloween special in Appalachia, choosing the Napier curse as his subject. He strutted into Clover Fork Hollow with cameras rolling, mocking the superstition, laughing at the warnings of locals. That night, he vanished. The footage recovered from his crew was unnerving. In one scene, Gerald stands at the entrance of an abandoned Napier cabin, joking about meeting the devil's kin. The screen abruptly flickers, and a final frame shows Gerald's face contorted in shock before cutting to black. His body was never found. Still, not everyone feared the hollow. In 1992, a sheriff's deputy named Earl Kinney was sent to investigate reports of squatters on the Napier land. He returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. All he told his wife was, "There ain't no squatters. It's them." Earl left his badge on his kitchen table the next day and left town forever. Even into the 1990s, the Napier bloodline remained a ghostly thread in Appalachian life. By then, only a handful of relatives were still alive, most of them reclusive, scattered, and reluctant to admit their lineage. But the curse seemed to outlast flesh and bone. Locals whispered that the hollow itself had become the heir of the Napier name, a living memory that punished anyone foolish enough to trespass. The skeptics, once so eager to shine their lights into the darkness, had only fed it. Each investigation, each headline, each attempt to expose the truth left behind more missing people, more broken lives, more whispered warnings. By the dawn of the new millennium, Clover Fork Hollow was no longer seen as a place to be studied. It was a place to be avoided at all costs. For the people of Appalachia, one truth had become chillingly clear. The Napier curse was no longer confined to blood alone. It had become part of the land itself, patient and eternal, waiting for those who doubted to draw near. By the 2000s, the Napier curse had become something between legend and warning. For outsiders, it was a creepy Appalachian ghost story. For locals, it remained a line you did not cross. Clover Fork Hollow was left off maps, its dirt roads overgrown, and its cabins rotting into the soil. Yet the silence around it only drew more curious souls. In 2003, a group of college students from Louisville entered the hollow armed with camcorders. The footage they left behind, later uploaded to early internet forums, was unsettling. They laughed and joked as they walked through the collapsing Napier homestead until one girl suddenly turned, staring into the trees. She whispered, "They're watching us." Moments later, the camera dropped to the ground. The students returned, home pale, shaken, and unwilling to speak about what happened. One transferred schools. Another vanished a year later while hiking alone. By 2011, urban explorers with YouTube cameras tried their luck. One video titled "Kentucky's Most Haunted Hollow" racked up millions of views before it was deleted. Viewers reported strange glitches in the footage, faces in the windows of abandoned cabins, shadows moving behind the explorers, and at one moment, a faint voice muttering, "Leave the blood." The channel owner who uploaded the video never posted again. Local law enforcement still avoids the land. In 2017, a sheriff's deputy responding to an ATV accident near Clover Fork radioed a single phrase before his signal went dead: "It's the Napiers." His partner found him standing in the woods minutes later, unhurt but glassy-eyed, repeating the same sentence over and over. He resigned the following week, and in the present day, the legend thrives in whispers. Hunters claim to hear screams that echo through the hills at night. Families swear their children come home from playing near the hollow speaking in strange, archaic words, and genealogists who attempt to trace the Napier line report files corrupted, archives missing, and, most chilling of all, phone calls late at night where no one speaks. The question remains, did the Napier curse die with the bloodline? Or did it take root in the soil of Appalachia itself? Is it superstition born of tragedy, or a darkness that still waits for anyone who dares to look too closely? If you've made it this far into the shadows, you're one of us. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the Napier bloodline was truly cursed, or was it the land itself that became haunted? And let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every response. Subscribe to Eerie Records to join the dark family, where every week we resurrect another forgotten story from the past that was never meant to be told. Until next time, keep your lights low and your doubts lower.